Foreign Secretary, have you received any guidance or advice or received any submissions from FCDO or government lawyers that Israel may be in breach of international humanitarian law?
Say that again?
Have you received any legal advice from the FCDO or government lawyers that Israel may be in breach of international humanitarian law?
What I've received is advice as part of this process that I've just described to the Chair, and the advice then was passed on consistent with that advice, as it were, to the Department of Trade.
No, in terms of Israel's actions post October the 7th, are you... Okay, let me ask you personally, have you seen any evidence, been made aware of any evidence, or have reasonable grounds to believe that Israel has breached international humanitarian law?
No. Well, what I have to do is act on the advice that I'm given, and that advice is based on what we believe is happening, and so we ask a whole series of questions of the Israeli government about individual actions that are brought to our attention, and then we receive advice on that, consider that advice, and then pass it on to the Department of Trade for them to make the decision about arms exports.
I understand your relationship with the Department of Trade, but what I'm asking you, Foreign Secretary, is have you been made aware or seen any evidence or have reasonable grounds to believe that Israel has breached international humanitarian law?
Not arms exports.
Nothing to do with arms exports. This is about the international
I've seen lots of things that have been deeply concerning.
In your assessment as Foreign Secretary, has Israel at any point in its response breached international humanitarian law?
My job is not to make the legal adjudication, because I'm not a lawyer. It's for me to consult my lawyers in the department and say, will you reach a judgment about whether this does breach international humanitarian law based on, as I said, the commitment, the capability and the compliance.
No, that takes me back to my initial question then. Have your lawyers in the FCDO or in government given you any advice as to whether Israel has breached international humanitarian law? Because you seem to be saying to us that it has been examined by the FCDO.
So I don't want to sound like I know what you're asking, and I don't want to
answer it.
Well, I don't want to be difficult. I don't want to give an inaccurate answer, and I don't want to, I've described to you the process because it's a process. So of course you see lots of things that you think, well, is that in line with international? Is that
okay? Well, let me take you away from process to more specifics. About 2 or 3 minutes ago, in answer a reply to the chair, you said, and I quote, "One of the things we'd like the Israelis to do is switch the water back on." Now, that says that they turned it off. It says that you recognise they have the power to turn it on. Therefore, isn't turning water off and having the ability to turn it back on but choosing not to, isn't that a breach of international humanitarian law?
It's just something they ought to do, in my view.
No, of course they should do it. Every human being would say you don't cut people's water supply off. But I'm asking you, in your position as Foreign Secretary, around the point of international humanitarian law, if Israel have the power to turn the water back on that they turned off, surely that is a flagrant breach of international humanitarian law.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. My view is they ought to switch it on. You don't have to be a lawyer to make a judgment about that. You just have to be a human being.
Forgive me, Sir Philip, under international obligations, do occupying powers have an obligation to provide access to water, yes or no?
You're asking me a technical legal question?
Sir Philip, I'm really, forgive me, you and I have played this dance enough times. We all know that under international law there is an obligation for occupying powers to provide water.
You're asking me a technical question about occupying powers and what their obligations are in international law. I imagine you're correct, Chair, but I'm also not a lawyer. I also just would point out,
Philip, just bear in mind, we've come to such a good place working with you because we have the confidence that you do know these details, and that's what your colleagues say. You know that it's not that you presume I'm correct. That is the duty on an occupying power.
Yeah, so yes. Chair, I think that is right. So yes, but I would also add that in answering your questions earlier about occupying occupation.
I'm not asking you to apply it to Israel. The facts are, though, that they are required to. And just Lord Cameron, just to clarify, so you have received no advice at any point from any government lawyer that states that Israel is in breach of international humanitarian law?
That's not what I said.
No, that's why I'm asking you to clarify.
Yes, well, I'm going to give exactly the same answer all over again, which is what my role is, right?
I'm not interested in the role, I'm interested in the legal advice you've received.
Yes, well, the legal advice I've received is consistent with the fact that we have not changed our export.
It's not about arms
procedures.
exports, it's about international humanitarian law being upheld when it comes to aid, when it comes to the way in which airstrikes have been prosecuted, everything else. We're one question on arms exports, we've moved from them. In any realm, in any respect. So you've never had a piece of paper put in front of you by a Foreign Office lawyer that says that Israel is in breach of its international humanitarian commitments under international humanitarian law?
Look, the reason for not answering this question, I can't recall every single bit of paper that's been put in front of me.